We are now in the second part of this virtual Remembrance Day event brought to you by Black History Ottawa. Black History Ottawa is a registered charity that carries out year-round programming with a concentration of activities in February for Black History Month. This segment features a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Sarah Onyengo.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Marie. And I'd just like to mention that Jean-Marie Guerrier is our Vice President of Black History Ottawa. Well, it is my pleasure to be moderating this conversation with two brilliant researchers, Black Canadian history enthusiasts, friends of Black History Ottawa, who have a keen interest in Black Canadian military history. So I'd like Sion Foyne to just introduce himself and tell us about the work that you have done on Canadian Black military history.
Yes, hello. My name is Cian Foyne. I've been doing research on African Canadians, Black folk in the Canadian military, in the British forces, in the American forces. It's sort of a piece of the history that I really enjoy looking at. Sort of started, for me, I had always been a big fan of history, and growing up in Nova Scotia, I don't think I ever really asked myself why I wasn't studying Black history in school. And just before I started university, I started, discovering more and more about Black Nova Scotia history, because we have a pretty solid movement down there. And so then when I went on to university, I just simply reasoned that, here I am at university and I'm going to take advantage of being on a university campus. And so what I did, recognizing there's no Black history program, I was at Dalhousie, there was no Black history program at Dalhousie at the time. I just used the opportunity for all of my term papers to do a research on something to do with Black Canadian history. So whatever, if I was doing pre-Confederation Nova Scotia, I'd find some story about Black folk in Nova Scotia and do a research paper on it and submit it to my professors. And for the most part, they accepted it, sometimes with a bit of resistance, but otherwise, hey, there's your paper. So I had encountered Dr. Senator Kelvin Ruck on campus at Dalhousie one day. I was actually doing sound for an event that he was at, and he was talking about his book, The Number 2 Construction Battalion, on the Number 2 Construction Battalion. So I bought the book and got him to sign it and read the book. And couple of summers later, he came across me. I was working at the Black Cultural Center. And I was talking to him about his book. And, I was saying it's a good history. And Senator Ruck told me through a whole bunch of conversations, that it's not a history. He said he wasn't a historian and that he was trying to capture these stories before the people who knew the stories were no longer with us. And then he kept hinting, because he knew I'd been accepted to go to graduate school and that I was coming to Ottawa. And he kept hinting and hinting and hinting that, the military records are in Ottawa and, somebody's got to do a history. And so when I came to Ottawa, that's what I started to pursue. So my research was on the Number 2 Construction Battalion. My thesis was entitled African-Canadian Enlistment, the Underside of Glory, African-Canadian Enlistment in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, 1914 to 1917. And so what I did with that piece is I broke it down into 3 essential chapters. So the first chapter was looking at the debate around African Canadians, Black folk joining the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The second chapter was about 3 newspapers that I knew one of them and I discovered the other 2 in the process of my research. Well, sorry, I knew 2 of them, forgive me. So one was the Atlantic Advocate, which was a newspaper printed in Nova Scotia, produced by Black folk in the north end of Halifax. It was maybe 5, 6 issues. It didn't last long, but it was a good effort. The other one was the Canadian Observer, which was published in Toronto. And the third one was the Crisis Magazine. So what I did with those is I started looking through to see what the Crisis Magazine's a NAACP newspaper. So with those, I started looking to see how those papers were covering the war and covering the conversation and the debate about Black folk being in the Canadian military and the British military and the American military. And then the last chapter was kind of a demographic analysis of who ended up joining the number 2 construction battalion when it was ultimately formed. And then looking at a bit of their wartime experience. So that was my thesis. What I also did when I was doing that work, because I was wondering if it had any relevance to anybody besides myself, because I was very excited about the work, and I knew Senator Ruck was. He was always, checking in on me and seeing how I was doing. So I organized 3 lectures at the Library of Canada and just went over my chapters. And it was a great way to test whether or not the work I was doing at a university translated to people outside of the university. And it was an absolutely fantastic experience. We ended up, talking till like 12 o'clock at night. Commissioners are coming around like, hey, the room was closed 2 hours ago. You people gotta go. So yeah. And I know we're framing our time, so I've got to be careful about not getting too much into the story of the number 2 construction battalion.
But we will come back. We will come back to that work. And speaking of the number 2 construction battalion, guess what I have?
That looks familiar.
Yes, signed by the senator, by the way, before he passed away, and a lot of
the second edition, I think. Yeah, second and third.
And our some of our Legacy Voices veterans who are no longer with us. Speaking of Legacy Voices, we are fortunate to have the founder of the Legacy Voices project, Kathy Grant. So, Kathy, why don't you tell our audience about, how you started working on Black Canadian military history and then your connection to the Canadian Forces?
Okay, well, I got connected with the number 2 construction battalion through Tamus Gale, who documented approximately 1,400 Blacks that served in the Great War. And of those 1,400, about 600 were of the number 2 construction battalion. So I was just very fortunate to get that through my dad, who was a Second World War veteran who volunteered to fight for Canada. And by going through all those records, they were on like little recipe cards, and each had their date of birth, their name, when they're enlisted. So I took a lot of that information and I came to Ottawa and I went to Library and Archives Canada and I pulled the records that were linked to the number 2 construction battalion and all of the letters that were sent to the commanding officers, how it started, and in addition to the number 2 construction battalion, they also had other people like the Irish and the Aboriginals. So it was all across the country, different ethnic groups wanted to get into the service. So in there, I found some remarkable documents where you would find members of the Black community wanting to, enlist or be examined. And there was one where there were these 2 gentlemen that were being examined by, or were to be examined by a forces Army doctor. And he turned to the civilian doctor who interviewed them or examined them and said that he was very glad that they didn't examine the ends. They used the N-word. And it was quite shocking to go and read that. And you'll see that offensive term at least a few times within the documentation that is at Library and Archives Canada. So that was a shock to me.
But that is just the number two. What about how you initially got into documenting and promoting Black Canadian military history? You did mention your dad. That's
Yes.
how I got connected
So
to
my
history.
dad,
Yeah.
before he passed away, my dad's been documenting Black military history pretty much since he got out of the war in the 1940s. So he has gone around to all of these veterans and he documented and got their pictures. And he was ill. And before he passed away, he said, Kathy, I want you to promise that you would continue the legacy of documenting these stories and make sure that the Canadian government honors these soldiers, as well as that educators and students learn about the number 2 construction battalion. So he passed away in 2005, and I've been doing that ever since. We got the Department of National Defense to go and honor the soldiers. We got Veterans Affairs Canada to interview them. We have their video clips being hosted by Veterans Affairs Canada. And I guess students, teachers, educators are now knowing that part of history. And we're going out to schools. We've had exhibits. We had one at the War Museum. We had one, there was a plaque in Bailey in 2005 to honor the West Indian veterans. In the year 2000, my dad started laying a wreath at the War Memorial in Ottawa, first for the West Indian veterans. But before he passed away, he said, Kathy, we must get the government to recognize all of the soldiers that wore, the Black soldiers that wore the Canadian uniform. So that is, that's been my mission, it's been my passion, it's been my love. And it's a part of Canadian history. It's a part of Canadian history which is underrepresented, and it is something that children or students need to know. And I find when I take some of these images and show them to some of the members of the Black community, you just kind of see them kind of like sit up straight. And there's this pride that you see in their face because you see, we served. It's not like we served too, we served. We served, we were patriotic like everybody else. Our friends got killed. We wanted things to be better for our families. And that is one of the main reasons why we went to war.
Yeah, so full disclosure, your dad actually is the one that got me into this obsession with Black Canadian military history. And I actually met you at his funeral. And I had made him the same promise that you made to him. And he had decided that you and I would meet and that you and I would work together to continue his legacy of promoting and documenting and preserving this history. So you created Legacy Voices. Can you tell our audience what that is?
Okay, it's an organization that documents and digitizes Black military history as well as Canadian history, but the focus is on Black military history. We started a Facebook page with a couple of members about 6-7 years ago, and now we have over 8,000 members that are part of our page. And we will post pictures. We're very image rich, and we would post a picture and someone would say, oh, that's my grandfather, that's my uncle. And then they would share more pictures, and then they would share and share and share. So we would get people even from overseas that would say, oh, I had a Black person that visited me, or he was part of our unit, and they would send me their picture. And it's just connecting, or if they're overseas, they might go over and take a picture of the grave so that they're honored. So it's ongoing, it's getting it into schools. The fact that we were able to film these veterans and have them tell their stories before they passed away, that legacy is ongoing because veterans are not going out to schools because they're old, but also now because of COVID, you can't. So this week we were able to do 6 Zoom interviews with students. We did an entire school, kindergarten all the way up to grade 8. We did some high school students, and we shared those videos. And they were able to do the Korean War, World War II, peacekeeping, and they're all digitized. They're all closed captions. They're all transcribed. They all have the bio. So when they do projects, and there's someone from the Black community that could say, okay, this person was in the Korean War. This person was in World War II. This person did peacekeeping. This person was in the Cold War. We have Walter Peters, Dr. Stephen Blizzard, Jack Pollitt, flight surgeon, and you just see their eyes just open wide, and they get to see and hear their experiences. So it's great. The technology that we have today is being welcomed by schools, and just this week, schools said, you know what, more and more kids have said that they want to go and take schooling from home because of COVID. So they're saying that they now have to go and change things so that things are now video. So now they think that it's perfect opportunity to go and use these types of resources because they're there.
Mhm. So I'm going to go back to Sion before I come back to you again, so you can talk to our audience about how Legacy Voices has engaged not just school children, but also the community members and families of veterans in, for example, that wreath laying tradition. So Sion,
Mm.
so question for you, what kinds of challenges did you face, in trying to gather material about Black Canadian military history?
Well, I think the first challenge that I encountered was a little bit of a challenge getting people at the universities, academics, professors to even understand or see it as sort of an important subject area, because they simply lacked the knowledge of it. And then at that point, so like as far as the military, Kathy knows this very well. I mean, the Canadian Expeditionary Force and the people who were managing and running the Canadian Army, for lack of a better term, during the First World War, they did actually quite a marvelous job of collecting and maintaining records. The records are very well done. So in my case at that time, the only way you could access that material was to go to the National Archives. So I spent a lot of time in the reading room and a lot of time in the research facilities, calling up documents and going through them. As far as the using the Crisis magazine, I had to basically, do interlibrary loans to get a hold of the material. And the other ones, the Canadian Observer, I found copies of that in the National Archives, in the military records, because there was a gentleman, J.R.B. Whitney, who was advocating on behalf of Blacks who wanted to join the Expeditionary Force. And so occasionally he would send copies of his newspaper to military officials in Ottawa. And so they ultimately ended up in the records. And the Atlantic Advocate, I got that when I was down home in the public archives of Nova Scotia. So in my case, the records that I was working from were particularly accessible from the different sources that I was able to find. The difficulty was, trying to read them in a different way. So, there was there was a tendency in certain circles to dismiss the value and the relevance of certain information, like what can okay, so this newspaper is doing a whole piece on, what's been going on in the, in the church community, right? This Baptist church is having this reunion or that reunion, and so like, depending on your cultural perspective, it's like, all right, so these 5 people were, at the church, But if you know the Black communities, if you understand how the Black communities work, you know that that church is a social institution in those communities. So if you're going to find a place where people are named, where people are, their relatives are named, and, their communities and what they do, then that's where you're going to find it. And then that can lead you, down the path of finding other stuff. So this person's here and this person's over here, and, they're the cousin of this other person. So, it was a bit of a dance, but, they say that sometimes doing history is a bit of detective work in the first place. So, you got to build that and put it all together. So, yeah, I mean, in my case, the information was kind of there, but I had to really think hard about how I was going to put it together. And then also one of the reasons why the Crisis magazine was so important, because when I ultimately looked at, who joined the #2 Construction Battalion, you also find out that there was a lot, there was a significant number of African Americans, right? So, and then to find references to the #2 Construction Battalion in this American newspaper, and using, in some ways using the story or the creation of the #2 Construction Battalion as a bit of a stick to beat the American government, to say, like the Canadians are doing it, how come you can't do it, sort of thing. So that was a bit of an interesting thing. So you have to figure your way through those sources. The Canadian Observer was also an absolutely fantastic source, because J.R.B. Whitney, amongst others, just ran this constant campaign, pressuring the government in Ottawa, pressuring the Governor General's office, and then so I would, in going through those newspapers, I'd start to see names again popping up, and people and that sort of thing.
Kathy, so let's talk about interviews, because those were challenging, and I know what I'm talking about, because I did quite a few of the veteran the latter interviews that ended up on the Veterans Affairs website. Can you speak to the challenges in coming up with interviews with, enough information to engage the public?
Okay, I guess I found World War II veterans uh, were, because they had some of the most compelling stories. And there was Calvin Marshall in Montreal, whose father was in the First World War, and also Ken Jacobs, which you interviewed. And they're very different stories. I know that with Calvin Marshall, um, he talks about how much he enjoyed his service in the Army. A lot of his stories are very humorous. They're very upbeat. But with Lieutenant Colonel Jacobs, it was a very different type of interview. And I had the opportunity to listen to the full interview, and a lot of it stems from, I guess, like the racism that he experienced living in Canada, where they wouldn't be able to go to restaurants, they weren't able to go to theater, they weren't able to go to skating rinks, and all of this. So whereas Calvin went and volunteered, um, Lieutenant Colonel Jacobs, he was conscripted, because he's figures like, why should I enlist to fight for rights when I'm not experiencing them here? And I know that Veterans Affairs Canada did a modified version of the clips, but when I listened to the full version, I was shocked at what he experienced, talking about going to school and then going to in winter and then going to university, and some of his friends wouldn't even speak to him, and he had to get out, and then going into the Army and working, I guess, like in the operating room, where he wanted to continue medicine. And then one of the doctors saying, when he was a captain, telling him, get out, get out, get out, get out. And they're wondering, why is he telling him to get out? They're saying, oh, he touched your nose. He didn't touch his nose. And then it turns out that they took him off the operating room to go and deliver bedpans because they told him it was because it was bothering the patients, but it wasn't bothering the patients. It was bothering the racist doctors who were there. That there was like a black man who was doing this. So there's lots of stories that we find from speaking with these veterans where they talk about, I guess, like racism that they experienced when they came back to Canada. Some of them were saying that they were treated like men for the first time when they enlisted. So like people like Lloyd Husbands, who was like in the Signal Corps, um, Buddy Jones, he had a good relationship going through. But a lot of them said that when they came back to Canada, it was the same nonsense that they had to deal with. And that was very hard for them. So it was like a kick in the belly.
Mhm. So, Kathy, speaking of stories, can you talk about the challenge in accuracy, getting accuracy from these stories? How do you
Oh,
go about that as someone who's very meticulous and particular about accuracy?
okay. I know that from the First World War, right now, Library and Archives Canada has digitized all 600,000 records that are there. So by pulling the military files themselves, it shows, I guess, in what action they were in. So for a lot of the number 2 construction battalion, there's like a myth that some of them were at Vimy. They could not have been at Vimy because they didn't leave. They would have been in quarantine in England. So there's stories like that. And sometimes you have to actually burst some people's bubbles and
Yes.
say, well, they couldn't be this.
Yeah.
Or Reverend White being the only Black officer when there was about at least 7. And people will say, well, he was the first. Well, he wasn't the first. So it's pulling the records. So the records actually are viewed more as the Bible because it's documented. It's documented. And you can show whether they were injured, whether they were gassed. Some people say, oh, he was suffering from being gassed. And though the number 2 construction battalion weren't gassed, they did not defuse landmines. They did not carry men who were wounded in battle off the battlefields. Like those are stories that keep being repeated um, that are not accurate. And they have done such wonderful work, the number 2 construction battalion, that doesn't need to be the myth to
Mhm.
continue these stories.
So what do you do when you come? Because I know sometimes you post things online to set the record straight. Like, so what do you do when you catch inaccuracies?
I generally approach the person,
Hmm.
and sometimes I know, like I said, with CBC, there was one with Jeremiah Jones, who should have gotten a medal for Vimy Ridge, but they've been saying that how he was also wounded at Passchendaele. I said, well, he wasn't. And CBC wrote an article this year, and they said, well, in this, like, thing, well, in Historica, it's been written all along for the last 10, 20, 30 years. I said, but if you pull the military file, it doesn't. So then they went and they got 3 historians that were part of the War Museum to go through the records. And they said, well, no, he could not have been at Passchendaele because he was in the hospital in England. And then they went and they posted on the article, well, we received information from Kathy Van Legacy Voices Project, and he was not at Passchendaele. So for online, they can correct it, but if it's already printed in the book, they can't. Like
Hmm.
one person for Curly Christian, they said, well, Curly Christian, should he have gotten his pension because he laid down on the railroad tracks and got his arms and limbs run over because he was drunk. And this is written by the #1,
Wow.
I guess, a historian in Canada about World War I history. They had received the companion of the Order of Canada, and here he is writing it in the book. And when you challenged him, he said, well, there's no way to check it now. I said, well, you're a teacher, you just pull the records. So we gave him a copy of the military records. And then I said, well, you need to, I guess, like, apologize to the family or write a retraction. And their response was, well, if another version comes out and they pay me to write it, the correction will happen at that time. So
Wow.
online is easier to correct than printed. So if we find something online, we get in contact with whoever has authored it and get them to change it. If it's an organization, we ask that they change it. Sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Like currently, CBC Kids has that posted that the #2 Construction Battalion defused landmines, and they said that Curly Christian was a member of the battalion. He wasn't.
It was not.
And
Yeah.
they said, well, this is going out to school children, and they will give false reports because
Right.
what they see online. So
Mhm.
it's getting in contact with them is the best way, and following up. That's the main thing. So sometimes you say they're going to do it and assume it's going to happen. And when it doesn't happen, you have to go back and keep knocking on doors and knocking on doors.
Mm-hmm. So that's about accuracy. And I'm gonna ask this question to both of you. I'll start with Kathy. Um, including our Black military history in, the cultural institutions like museums, for example. Can you talk about the work you were talking about, Curly Christian? So can you tell our audience very, very briefly about the battle you had to have him included in the Vimy exhibit?
Yes, so we had him at our exhibit to honor the men in the First World War, but we had to knock on doors to get them to accept the scrapbook from the Vimy Memorial. And after putting it through, and then we said, okay, so it's going to be there for the 100th anniversary. And when we went there, it wasn't there, it wasn't included. And I think that was frustrating for me because we thought that it was going to be there. I came from Toronto to Ottawa and it wasn't included. That was troubling to me. Also, Library and Archives Canada, it took 2 or 3 years for them to get back to me to say that they were not going to accept it. But now that the War Museum in Ottawa has it, I hope that they're going to publicize it and digitize it so that others can see it. There's a museum in Calgary that has digitized it, and they gave us the files. So now we can send those off to schools. So we're going to encourage the War Museum to go and do it, but if they don't, we'll do it ourselves and get it available for students to see.
Sion? Sion.
Yes.
Yes. Inclusion. Have you seen an improvement in the way Black Canadian military history is treated in the mainstream since you started out back in, oh my goodness, the early 2000s? I remember meeting you when you were doing that work on the #2 Construction Battalion. Have things changed for the better?
I'm not sure if things have changed for the better. There's a couple of things. Kathy and I have crossed paths numerous times, and we've had various conversations about this. I know that when I met Kathy, it blew my mind how much work her father had done and how much work she had done about identifying lots of different people. I came across the point when I was doing my research, because my story was really the story of what happened when Blacks tried to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And so in many ways, and I love the fact that you started talking about myth and challenging sources and things. So the number 2 construction battalion wasn't a foregone conclusion, right? Blacks were not told that in order to serve, you have to be, in a construction battalion. So, and Kathy mentioned Jeremiah, Mr. Jones, and he fought, right, and he was subsequently posthumously given the service medal for for his service. What I encountered was, first off, the so-called professional historians and the so-called gentleman historians. I'm not sure which one Kathy was battling with at the War Museum, but it might be a cohort of people that I had to. Well, I didn't really battle with them and argue with them. I just said, I don't really care what you have to say. This is my research. This is my work. You've never done this work before. You're not talking about these people, so I don't really care. An interesting thing that has happened is, as more people, black and white, who actually care about these stories, who actually do the really, really hard work of pulling the stuff together. In the last few years, Kathy and I have both noticed a couple of little pieces that have popped up where kind of the same cohort and culture of people that didn't want this work being done, didn't really recognize the value of it being done, they're now coming back and applying, their worldview on the work that was done, right? So I've seen a couple of well, frankly, silly critiques of some of the work in my thesis, because it's he's only this whole chapter is just talking about the letters, and that's exactly what I intended to do. I actually intended to take the process of giving these people a voice, right? Like these are very articulate, amazing letters written by people who were very passionate about this. There has been increased talk about Black folk in the Canadian military structure. In some circles, in my experience with people in the military, people in D&D, it's been like, oh, okay, this is part of our history, this is part of our heritage. We didn't know about it, and they're on board and bringing it forward.
So there's, for example, there's that traveling exhibit, right?
Yes.
That they
Yeah.
created years ago.
Yeah. In other places, it's just being, sucked up and spit back out by people who want to create a non-racist myth about Canada, right? So it's like, oh, these people proudly serve their country, but they don't talk about, they don't talk about what the institutions, and it's very important for us. I think it's important to make this note. What the institutions, and most importantly in this country, what people who work their way into positions of institutional power and authority, how they respond. And Kathy might have some views from the interviews and the conversations that she's had. I know from the work that I've done, I see this trend where, Black folk try to join. They're rejected by the leadership. They're rejected, in a large portion by the people who are supposed to be, operating the society, right? Who we give this authority to look after our society. Those who do end up not having to encounter that and actually end up in combat positions or in field positions or even backline positions, because, no one should be surprised that there's a lot of people in the military doing backline functions, because it's a huge, it's a monstrous machine, right? The work that I've been doing, they just find themselves, in the company of people like, okay, I've never met any Black people before in my life, and they might have some racism, they might not, but generally speaking, they're accepted. Right. So, so, And the piece about the media too, I'm glad that Kathy brought that up too. We don't do a very good job of teaching and examining and enjoying history in Canada in the first place.
Agreed.
And the media organizations that we have don't do a very good job at all of dealing with the subtleties or the accuracies of things. So, Kathy's mentioned a few. When I was doing my work on the number 2 construction battalion, I was constantly encountered by people. I got to a point where I said, like, I'm not even talking to media people anymore. Because, if I sit down with you and I explain the story and I show you documents, and the only thing in that reporter's mind and their editor's mind is to take a piece from an American view, right? And usually not even a well done American view of Blackness in the military, and impose it on the Canadian reality. So I encountered that constantly. Oh, the only thing they let the Blacks do was carry picks and shovels. Well, no, that's actually not true at all. The number 2 did what it did. They and they provided the service that they did as the battalion that they did. But at the same time, there was forestry corps full of white Quebecers. There was tunneling and digging corps and units full of white Cape Bretoners, right? Because that's what they needed. They needed people in the military to do these functions for the military, right? So it's not just necessarily a thing that Blacks had to do this because that's the only way they would accept them, right? And clawing through that myth, because it doesn't do service for the people who did the things that they did. It's dismissive of the importance of the work that people did, right? And it completely obliterates all of the other history and all of the other things that people who actually carried firearms or fired cannons and things like that. So yeah.
So our conversation could go on for many hours, but we don't have many hours. But I'd like to ask Kathy about, since you brought up media, the treatment that you've seen, because Kathy, you've been in the media quite a bit, talking about different Legacy Voices initiatives. Can you speak to that? Has it changed from since the days your father used to try to promote this history?
I find that CBC over the last few years have been very receptive. We've done a number of interviews with them. So they talked about the promise I made to my dad. They linked in the work that I'm doing with Legacy Voices, as well as the Black Canadian Veteran Stories of War. Another group actually came with me to the Toronto District School Board, where we had an exhibit where they promoted that we're trying to be more inclusive. So I find that there is depending on who the reporter is, the way and not in a way. So that helped. I find that helped. And then also, I guess, CPAC came out as well for when we interviewed members of the family that were part of the battalion and part of members that were in the Great War.
Okay.
One thing I find, I guess, with the media is that when it comes to the First World War, there seems to be an exclusion of a lot of men, I guess, who were not in the number 2 construction battalion. They focus on like maybe 1 or 2, but in reality, there were more people who were in non-segregated units that were in segregated units. So there was about 800 that managed to get in. And I think that does not get publicized.
Yeah, probably because it's not sexy enough or whatever. Like there's no sort of,
Well,
titillating
yeah,
information in there. Right,
it's a
Dion?
curious. Yeah, no, it's a very curious thing. I mean, like for example, Jeremiah Jones, right? I mean, he told the recruit he joined in Nova Scotia the 106th Regiment. I think he went overseas with the Royal Canadian Regiment, the famed
Mm-hmm.
Royal Canadian Regiment. Um, I think he told them he was in his 30s when he enlisted. You know, and even to be in your 30s in 1916, 1917.
Yeah, that's old.
That's a few years up there, right?
Yeah.
But he was actually in his 50s, I think 50s, 40s when he enlisted. So he, um, and then he goes overseas and he fought at Vimy Ridge. He captured a German machine gun position. Um, and I think Kathy has a couple of obviously has gone through because my thing again was looking at the number 2 construction battalion, but along the way you can't help but see these other stories, right? And why they don't, well, why the focus has to be so much on the story of the number 2 construction battalion. And as someone who did all the research, it might seem odd, to say, why are you talking about this all the time?
Mhm.
Because it's an amazing story and all that, that's great. But, as we're saying, there's all kinds of other people. I mean,
Mhm.
my thought was there was at least 1,000 Black folk who fought, who enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. That's the number 2 construction battalion as well as others, right? So I think the number 2 was around 600 at strength when it went overseas. So that's at least 400 other people that, you know,
Mhm.
who have, stories of some sort that we could talk about. And I just think sometimes it's this need to focus on the suffering dynamic of certain
Yes,
media
there you go.
groups, right?
Yes. Mhm.
And I don't know, as a lifelong student of history, I don't think that does I don't think that does the exploration of history any good to just keep focusing on the suffering, because really what the narrative that comes out of that is, it was so bad a long time ago. These people, stood up and then they served Canada and now we're all a better place, right? And
Mhm.
that's just not true.
Yeah, very simplistic.
Right. Well, it's
So,
because it's like this tendency to try to look back at history in order to answer the question that you see right now, right?
mhm.
To say that this was a logical path. And so, just to use the number 2 as an example, um, you note that it's the number 2 construction battalion. So you have to ask, where's the
Number
number
one.
1 construction battalion,
That's right.
right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
the number 1 construction battalion was white.
Mhm.
So that blows away the myth that, oh, they would only let the blacks in because that's black people work, right? So that's gone. The other thing is that when, federal politicians, when the federal cabinet became, the pressure from the black community and their allies became so intense that when the cabinet was discussing this, there's a marginal note in the memorandum to the cabinet when they're talking about this, where maybe this is, you know, um, because what happened is the British Home Office, or the name is escaping me. It wasn't the Home Office, but because the Canadians fell under the British at this point in the war, they were asking for construction workers, labor units, and the cabinet was considering that conversation. And somebody wrote a marginal note. Well, maybe this is one of the answers for the black issue that we're having, right? So that's not a foregone conclusion, right? And
Mhm.
So, and then, sorry, the other thing is that even in that story, you know, the recruitment of the battalion was not as successful as people had hoped it to be, you know, and some of the work that I've looked at, you know, suggests that the reason why they didn't get 1,000 men is because, you know, black men said, "What, are you crazy?" You know, like, you know, if you won't let me fight for my country, if you won't let me join like anybody else in this country or like any other white person in this country, then why would I, you know, why would I go overseas and dig holes, right?
Mhm.
And that's not to dismiss the work that the guys did, but
Yeah. Well, fascinating, fascinating conversation. I feel like we need to have several other conversations about the work that you both do. Just to end our conversation, what tips would you have for people who do have veterans in their lives or in their lineage and would like to start doing, for example, what Kathy has been doing? Um, in terms of documenting and preserving that history, what tips would you have?
the first part is to see if veterans are open for conversation,
Uh-huh.
right?
Hmm.
You know, there was a point in my life when I was working at the Stadacona Naval Museum, and you know, I have my dad was in the military, my uncle was in the military. Um, I had a relative who fought in the resistance in Norway, and you have to be very careful of how you approach those conversations, right? So because you know you're dealing with people who, in some cases, have been through traumas that nobody on the planet can possibly understand unless you've been there,
Hmm.
and sometimes they simply do not want to talk about it. Right? They just plain and simply do not want to talk about it. So you have to be very careful about that. Around the edges of that, you can get people to talk about, yeah, I was in the Army, I was in the Navy, I was in the Air Force. And what I found was successful for me and worked for me and was respectful of where the people were is, you know, come at it from the humorous side, because you know, like there, you know, if you've been around people in the military and people, you know, like the entire military culture, you know, um, is just simply loaded with humor, right? You know, it's a very tragic, odd sense of humor, but you know, you can get into it that way, and then you can start to pick up the pieces, right? You know, oh, Uncle so and so was here. Uncle, you know, somebody was there, and you can start to collect the records, and you can start to collect, you know, the pieces of equipment that they might have, or the memorabilia that they might have, or you know, get a sense of where they were, right? And then you have to go and do some work on your own, right? You know, if people are still alive, you know, you're not going to get their records.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, there's, I mean,
Yeah.
and you know, read, you know, make sure you get your sense a sense of the background for the real story, for the big picture,
Hmm.
and you know, everybody is going to have a different story on the same story, right? So you
Hmm.
can have, you know, 6 people who were, you know, in Afghanistan, right? Who, you know, were at the Kandahar airport, and they were there on Tuesday morning when this happened, right? And you can talk to 6 different people and you can get 6 different stories
Hmm.
and enjoy that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Enjoy it, really, really enjoy it, and take it for what it is. And
Hmm.
then you got to go away and do your other part, right?
Yeah.
because there could be 6 people who are in 6 different parts of the base at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Sure that.
So
sure.
obviously they're going to have 6 different stories, right?
Yeah.
Um,
So
yeah,
let's get to Kathy. Kathy, what tips would you have? Because you've been at this for many years, collecting stories and documenting. What about an amateur person who just is interested in their family's military history? What tips do you have? Oh, have we lost her? I think we've lost Kathy.
Kathy.
Kathy. Oh dear. I think we've lost her. Yeah, I think we've lost her. Well,
I know Kathy. I mean, I know from Kathy's work, maybe she's going to come
yes.
back.
Yeah.
She takes a lot of pictures,
Yes.
right? She takes a lot
Very
of pictures.
visual.
Yeah. And when you take the pictures, depending on what device you're using, write on the back of them. As soon as if you're, do
Yes.
people still develop photographs?
No, not really.
So then if you're downloading them to your computer, go into the section where you can put the information and get the name in there, get the date that the photograph was taken, add the information about what unit they were with, where they that sort of stuff, like that very what we call tombstone information. Because whether you use it, and we see in the work that Kathy's father did, when you pass that work on to somebody else,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like it's
yeah, because Mr. Rowe, but in I mean, full disclosure also, he was also a journalist, so it helps that he had the instinct to catalog and archive and then catalog.
Yeah.
So that when she inherited all this material, it was pretty much organized. But
yeah, and
it was just, there was so much of it.
we have these now,
Yes.
right? So ask Uncle so and so,
record
ask
them.
Auntie so and so. Can I just record you?
Mhm.
Right? And the same thing. Yeah, very, very, very important. Grab them when you can, and be prepared. Some people, like I said, some people just, yep, I was over there, and that's it. They don't want to talk about it.
Right.
And other people will just, put
go
up your
on
feet.
and on and on.
Put up your feet because you're going to be here for a while.
Yeah, I've come across those veterans as well. Very entertaining, very interesting. Well, listen, it looks like we did lose Kathy, but I will, in her absence, thank her very much for all the work that she has done and continues to do with Legacy Voices, bringing community into a lot of the activities that she does. With the wreath laying, we've had descendants of various illustrious veterans. We've had young people, we've had cadets lay the wreath and learn about the history that they are representing on a specific year when Remembrance Day is being marked. She did mention a lot of the media interviews she's done to also promote all the work that's being done, and all of her advocacy with museums, not just the War Museum, as well. So, and thank you, Sion, for all that wonderful research that people can find where? Is it still available somewhere?
It's available at the Library and Archives of Canada. I mean, my thesis.
What is the title?
It's The Underside of Glory. African Canadian enlistment in the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And of course, Remembrance Day, we were not able to go to the monument. I know I see you there every year.
So
what are
that
your
I've been in
thoughts?
Ottawa.
What are your thoughts on Remembrance Day in the middle of this pandemic?
My thoughts on Remembrance Day in the middle of this pandemic are the same as my thoughts on Remembrance Day outside of the pandemic. Uh, Something that I've learned from studying a lot of military history, because I tend to look at it from the people point of view, from the community's point of view, is that war and war is a tragic, complete and utter failing of public policy leaders and so-called leaders, of politicians, of social and community leaders. It's an absolute awful, tragic failure of the responsibility that we give these people, that we allow these people to have. It's saddening and heartbreaking every year, every time I think about these people's stories, that the majority of people who die in wars are underclass and lower class people. And I think a lot about what that loss to life, to opportunities, for resources, that the havoc that it wreaks on our planet. And when I think of this stuff, I don't think it takes anything away from the effort and the sacrifice, and the commitment to, having to, because sometimes you just have to deal with bad people in the world. And I don't think it takes anything away from that to have these other feelings. So I have very complex feelings about Remembrance Day. I know as a history geek, coming out of the First World War, there was a lot of people who had served and a lot of people who had lost people who did not want to talk about it at all. Right? They were actually very resistant to building monuments and to, going around and doing things. So there's a whole fascinating history of how the Vimy Memorial in France comes about, and what all that iconography and what all that imagery is suggesting. So, that's what I think about every single Remembrance Day. And try to not let myself get caught up into, really banal, fake patriotic statements by certain politicians and certain leaders in the society, because I personally think that it degrades what people have done. I think about my dad. My dad was in the military. I think about my uncle. If I see any veterans anywhere near, a cash for a coffee shop, then they're at least getting a free coffee from me that day. Anybody in uniform, here's your coffee. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Yeah, and then like how this is going to play out, because we all know for how many years we've gathered and stood in the cold, and stood in the rain, and heard that bugle play, and like how is this going to? I'm very curious to see how it feels, right? Because you're not in that space with other people, right? And we all know when we all go downtown Ottawa and all the people who gather at Cenotaphs, everybody's going there with something, right? They're going there with something. And then to be in that space and just to have that sense, like you don't have to agree with what the person is thinking, right? But you're all there anyway, right? So I'm gonna miss that. Like yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sion, for
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for
the research that you've done. A very valuable part of our Canadian Black history, and hopefully you'll take on more research in the future.
Oh, I think Kathy's coming back.
Thank
Is
you.
Kathy back? My pleasure. My pleasure. I thought I saw Kathy coming
Yeah.
back.
Yes, she is trying to come back, and yeah, I
Is
just
she
want,
back?
he is trying to connect back, but I just really wanted to thank both Kathy and Sian for their passion and determination in researching and documenting the history of the Black Canadians in the military. And I found what this was very fascinating and very educational. So we hope that everybody that tuned in enjoyed that as well. And
I don't know what happened.
Oh, there she is.
The
So
phone,
Kathy,
yes.
yes. So we're concluding this session. I asked Sion what his thoughts are on this Remembrance Day, which is going to be a very particular one because we're in a pandemic.
Okay. I was showing this week Remembrance Day the last couple of years and telling all the students how it's going to be that much different. We're used to seeing thousands. We're used to seeing cadets. We're used to seeing all of these men walking women, even if they're in wheelchairs, and we're not going to see it this year. So it's going to be very, very, very different. Luckily, I wouldn't say luckily, but this year the Toronto Catholic School Board is actually having an Afrocentric Remembrance Day where they're insisting that the entire, I guess, the school board honor the veteran in one way. So we're having the students learn about them virtually. So at least it'll honor the veterans as well as take a look at what the other veterans have done and know what Remembrance Day is and know what peace is.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for taking part in this very fascinating conversation. And can you remind the audience where they can find you?
Okay, well, there's Black Canadian Veterans Stories of War. It's a Facebook page. Please join, take a look, take a stroll through the many stories and images and see if you might recognize one of the veterans. We post almost daily because every day is Remembrance Day, not just November.
Very well said. Thank you very much, and much success in whatever you're doing now and what you will be continuing to do, because I know this is a lifelong passion for you.
Yes, we want to get it into schools, and we think that we may start with one of the boards. I know that the Ottawa board as well has reached out, and we are going to be following up with them. So it's all learning for not only students but Canadians and the world, because we have to honor our veterans and continue to honor our veterans.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
all right. So we hope to
Thank
see
you,
you
folks.
all, I guess, November 11th, 2021 at the laying of the wreath with Legacy Voices as we honor our Black veterans.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Finish?
Mhm.
I'll stop the